Welcome to Exploring Computing. Today's video is Webpage Layout, Overview of Layout Techniques. So in this video, we're going to take a look at 4 different ways to lay out your web pages. 2 of these are currently in widespread use. One of them is there for historic reasons and to compare to our 4th method and to sort of highlight what's really great about the 4th method. And then the 4th method is the future of web page layout, but probably isn't as widely used yet as the middle 2 techniques. I'm actually going to recommend you use the 4th technique unless you've got a good reason not to. So let's take a look at these. So the first technique is table-based layout. This is no longer in use, but as I said, by comparing table-based layout to our 4th method, grid-based layout, you're going to really see what the advantage of using cascading style sheets is and why grid-based layout is a great way to go. The second technique we're going to talk about is float-based layout. This has been for many, many years the most widely used technique out there. I just did a quick spot check, and for example, the Washington Post is using float-based layout right now. Our third technique, Flexbox Layout, has picked up a little bit of momentum in the last maybe 3 years or so. I don't think it's a great choice. It's good to know about, and the techniques used in Flexbox are going to be useful for a variety of purposes, but I don't really think you should use this as your main layout technique. That was not the intention originally when it was developed. People have sort of used it as a hack. I don't think it's the best. I really do think this last one, the grid-based layout, is definitely the way to go. So, but you know, the 2 most commonly used techniques right now are float-based layout and Flexbox layout. So if you come onto an existing web page, those are the 2 techniques you're most likely to run into. The other thing to be aware of is that one of the reasons why grid-based layout, even though it's really great, isn't in widespread usage yet is that it's only been recently that all the web browsers are supporting it. And at this point, about 95% of the web browsers out there support it. So you may still run into a few web browsers that can't use it. Flexbox layout has about 97% support. And then float-based layout and table-based layout, everybody can use, but don't use table-based layout. Okay, we're going to go over 3 examples for each of these 4 techniques to sort of give us a chance to see how they work. I'm not actually going to be showing you any HTML or CSS in this particular video, but we will take an extensive look at grid layout in the next video. And then for the CS105 students, we're going to have a full lecture where we look at a bunch of different examples. And I recreate parts of the New York Times website and parts of the Washington Post website using grid-based layout so you can get a real good feel for how it all works. Okay, so our first example is going to be this simple 3-column web page right here. And then we're going to take a look at this web page that has a mix of different column formats. So we'll have 3 columns up at the top and 2 columns down at the bottom. And then finally, our last example is going to have this rather mixed layout here where, you know, it's not like there's 2 columns on the top and 3 on the bottom. It's really kind of a jumble. And so we'll see how each of the different layout techniques handles each of these 3 cases. All right, so table-based layout is based on the concept of tables. And so tables have been in HTML from the start. We talked previously about how HTML came out of physics, the CERN physics consortium out in Europe. And, you know, they were trying to exchange physics papers. And one of the things that you need for physics is tables. So we've had tables from the start. And so basically, for quite a while, we use these tables to lay out our web pages. I'll talk a little bit later about why this isn't the best approach. But so let's say I've got these. I want to go ahead and reproduce my 3-column website. How can I do this? Well, if you think about it, this 3-column website is it's a table where there's 1 row and 3 columns. So it's actually really straightforward recreating this using table-based layout. And then we've got our table here with different top and bottom sections. All right, so there's a couple ways to do this. So one thing that you can do is you can nest your tables. So we have one table which consists of a single column and 2 rows. And then within that first table, you have another table, which is a 3-column, 1-row table. And then at the bottom, you have a 2-column, 1-row table. Or you can have a single table where you have 4 columns and 2 rows, and then you can take advantage of the column span attributes to get some of your elements to span across multiple columns. So each of these approaches will work fine. And then finally, we have this mixed layout here. And so again, I think the easiest way to think about this is to think of nesting. And so one of the things that's going to occur with all of these techniques is you can use nesting. So you can say, oh, I'm going to go ahead and treat this as a layout where I have a column on the left and a column on the right. And then you can go in and say, well, in that column on the right, I need to lay that out. And so you can do a separate internal layout for the right column. And that's a good way of going about these things. So I can think of this whole thing as I have a 2-column, 1-row table. And then on the right column, I could say inside of that table, I actually have another table. And that table is 1 column and 2 rows. And then you can take it a further level and you could say, and the second row actually contains another table, which is 2 columns and 1 row. And this all works, but this is actually one of the reasons why we aren't really doing table layout anymore. And that is, as you start nesting the tables, it becomes more and more computationally expensive and slower to do layout. So generally 3 layers of tables was just fine, but once you started getting 4 or 5 or 6 layers of tables, it started getting kind of messy and the web browsers were not very happy with it. There are other reasons why this isn't the best approach, although some of these issues will also crop up with the next 2 techniques as well. Okay, so instead of treating this as a table nest inside of a table nest inside of a table, you could also treat this as a 3-column, 2-row table and then use row span and column span, and that could work as well. And, you know, depending on what you were trying to do, one of these or the other one might work better, but we're not going to worry about that in this video. Either of these techniques would work. So what are the issues with table-based layout? Well, one of the biggest issues is that the tables are in our HTML. So when we create our HTML, we are defining what our layout looks like in the HTML. And so we're really locking ourselves into a particular layout. And if we want to change the layout at a later point in time, let's say I wanted to change the layout for all the web pages on my website, I would need to go in and modify each of the HTML files because the HTML files has the layout encoded in the tables in those HTML files instead of being separated out from our cascading style sheets. Remember, that's what we said. We really want to have the presentation information of the cascading style sheet so I can modify the cascading style sheet and it instantly changes all the web pages on our website. And that doesn't work with tables. And in fact, we're going to discover it doesn't work with the next 2 techniques either. And then, as I mentioned, the nested tables can become computationally expensive. Okay, so we use the table-based layout for many, many years, but when we started using cascading style sheets, another technique came into the fore, and this is float-based layout. And float-based layout is still used quite a bit, and you will run into many websites that are using float-based layout. So how does float-based layout work? Well, the first thing to remind ourselves is, what is this idea of float? And so we've talked about float before in this class. We talked about floating images. So here on the left, I've got an image of Venice. I've floated to the left, and then I've got text alongside on the right. And then we did this example where we had images with captions underneath it. And in that case, I wasn't actually floating the image. I was actually floating some divs where the div contained both the image and the caption underneath it. But again, we would float those to the left or the right. And as I mentioned very briefly when we were talking about floats, you can float any block level element. And so here I've got a block quote and I've floated the block quote to the left. And you can see it's doing the exact same thing that our images did when we floated them to the left to the right. And so we can actually float multiple images, and that will actually stack the images next to each other. If I float 2 images to the left and, you know, assuming they fit, they will end up right next to each other. And I can do the same thing here with these block quotes. So what I've done here is I've added a second block quote, and I've told both the block quotes to float to the left, and they end up right next to each other, just as our original We had a single block quote. We floated that to the left. Now we've got two block quotes, and we floated those both to the left. And if you kind of think about what these two block quotes are doing here, floated to the left, well, those are essentially columns. And so I can get rid of the text other than the two block quotes, and this is what I have. And so I have two columns. And, if you've looked at any web page, they all are composed of different columns. So this is really the key to laying out web pages using floats. We go ahead and create these different columns, and we float them to the left. And so I was using block quotes. I can replace the block quotes with divs, and you can put basically any renderable element inside of a div. So here I've got two divs, both floated to the left. And so if we go to our three examples, if I want to lay out my three columns, I just go ahead and create three divs, and then I float each of the divs to the left. It is possible to mix floating to the left and floating to the right, but that gets messy in certain situations. It can also be useful in certain situations. But if you just float everything to the left, you can basically create any web page consisting of different columns. Okay, so what about our example where we have a mix of three columns on the top and two on the bottom? How am I going to handle this? Well, what you're going to do is you're first going to divide the web page into two divs. And these are just standard divs, and the standard behavior of a div followed by another div is to stack the two divs on top of each other. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put a bunch of divs inside of one of those standard divs, and instead of just using the standard behavior of the div, we're going to float those to the left, just as we did a little bit earlier. And then we'll do the same thing on the bottom. We'll create two divs down on the bottom, and we'll float those both to the left as well. And we'll actually get what we're expecting here, what we're looking for here. It does turn out there's a bit of messiness, which I'm going to completely ignore for this discussion. If you do want to use float-based layout, the benefit of using the float-based layout being that it does work in 100% of the web browsers out there, whereas our next two techniques, you'll recall that the next technique works in 97% of the web browsers, and the final technique only works in 95% of the web browsers. Float-based will work on all of them. Okay, so what about our mixed example here? Well, again, what we want to do is we want to think of a nesting. So I'm going to have two divs here, and I'm going to float both the divs to the left, and that's going to give me this concept of two columns. So I've got one column, I've got the red column, and then I have the light blue column. And then in the light blue column, I'm going to create two divs. And remember, if you've got divs and you're not floating the divs, that stacks the divs on top of each other. So I've got these two divs stacked on top of each other. And then the bottom div, I'm going to put another two divs in. I'm going to float those both to the left, and that's how I get this all to work. So the issues with float-based layout is it's still pretty tied to the HTML. So in order to get these columns floated to the left, I need to create the divs in exactly the right manner so I can move the elements in a particular way such that they do stack up next to each other. So it turns out that my HTML still is very closely tied to the layout. You can't just change the CSS and have a completely new web page. You can make some changes, but for the most part, the HTML and the divs that you choose and how you place the divs is going to really drive how the web page appears on in the web browser. There's also some messy issues which I'm completely ignoring here in order to get all these divs to work properly. They can certainly be handled. There are techniques to handle them, but it's not quite as clean as I may have led you to believe in our discussion here. But nevertheless, this technique is very widely used and has been the main technique used on web pages for quite a while. Now, the next technique uses something called Flexbox. So let's start off by talking a little bit about what Flexbox is. So Flexbox is designed to take a bunch of divs that are contained inside of a parent div and sort of to control what those inner divs look like. So one of the key things that you can do with those inner child divs is you can control whether or not they appear in a row or a column. So here I've got a row of divs, and then I can just easily change it to a column of divs just by changing one style sheet property. And there's some fancier things you can do as well. So so here I'm actually showing the parent div. So I've got A, B, C, and D contained within a parent div. So A, B, C, and D are divs, and they're contained in a parent div. And so you can see I can move the divs to the left, I can move them to the right, I can move them to the middle, I can spread them out. And so these are all different things that you can do very easily just by changing a style sheet property. You can also say, hey, if the divs fit, great. If they don't fit, I want to wrap. Or if you could say, if they don't fit, I want you to like squeeze them in there. And so there's different things that you can do with the child divs. You can select certain child divs and say, hey, if we've got the extra space, I want that to expand out to take the maximum amount of space available. And you can play with the alignment. So if you kind of think about what we've seen so far, you may be wondering, like, how does that, that seems useful, but that doesn't really seem to lay out web pages. And that certainly was the original intention. The intention was that Flexbox Layout was not designed to actually lay out web pages. I think what happened was people were really sick of the float-based layout, and it was messy, and you had to add in all this extra stuff in your HTML. And Flexbox Layout came along, and people were like, great, I'm just going to use it. Maybe this isn't what it was originally intended for, but I'm going to use it anyway. So what was Flexbox Layout actually intended for? Well, Flexbox and grid-based layout, which is going to be our last technique, both Flexbox and grid were defined at roughly the same time. And the idea was that you were going to use a mix of grid layout and Flexbox layout to lay out your web pages. The grid layout was going to be used for the major components and sort of figure out how everything overall was going to fit together. And you could use Flexbox for smaller components. So what do I mean by that? Well, here I've got a screenshot of the Washington Post, and you can see on the right side of the web page, I've got a bunch of different opinions. And so the opinions could be laid out using Flexbox, and the overall look of the web page would be laid out with grid. And then, so here's another example where we've got this center section called For Your Time at Home. And again, overall web page could be laid out with grid. And then the For Your Time at Home, that could be a little bit of a Flexbox right there. And so we haven't really talked about it, but among other things, Flexbox could also be used to set different ordering of elements. So, if let's say they knew that you really like chocolate and there were a bunch of recipes and one of them was chocolate, they could sort of tweak the style sheet using JavaScript and put the chocolate recipes at the top. And so this is the sort of thing that you could do with Flexbox. So again, Flexbox is useful. I certainly am not suggesting that if you're going to go off and create web pages, that you shouldn't know how Flexbox works. But as far as Flexbox being used for the entire web page layout, I don't think it's the ideal choice. Okay, so let's take a look at how Flexbox is used for layout. So we've got our 3 columns here. So this is pretty straightforward. I need a outer div because Flexbox always works with a parent div and then a bunch of child divs. So I'm going to go ahead and create the parent div. And then inside the parent div, I'm going to go ahead and put 3 children, 3 divs that are children. And then I'm going to tell it to use the Flexbox row. And so that says those 3 children should be laid out in a row as opposed to being laid out in a column. So that definitely works. For our messier technique here, the upper and lower columns 3 and 2, it gets a little bit messier though. So I'm going to start off by saying, okay, the entire thing, that's a div. We've seen this before. It has its useful property that we can use to center everything. And then inside of that div, I have 2 children, and those children are going to be laid out in column. And then each of those children are also going to contain their own children, and they will be laid out in rows. So I can do this on the top and the bottom. So that works. And then for our mixed example here, again, I'm going to go with this idea of nesting. And so I've got the outer div and it has 2 children and those are laid out as rows. And then the second child, that has 2 divs and those are laid out as columns. And then the second child has 2 more divs and those are laid out in rows. So this does work. The issues involved here are as we're still fairly tied to the HTML. We can do some things where, you know, the HTML is already set up and we can change the direction. So this actually could work pretty well for, you think about like if I've got a desktop monitor, maybe I want to lay things out in a row, but if it's going to be on a cell phone, that's going to be really narrow. So I want them to appear in column. So you can do some things with it, but the changes are pretty limited and we are still limited by the idea that certain elements are contained within certain other elements, and that's going to really determine what we can do with our cascading style sheet. So we can do something with the cascading style sheets, but overall, a lot of it is still limited by what's specified in the HTML. Okay, so we've got our last technique here, grid layout. In grid layout, we break down the web page into a grid, and then we place elements onto any square in the grid. And you can also do the row span and the column span if you want to get fancier. So, you know, if you want to say, oh, I want that element to go across these 2 grid elements, that's totally fine. If you want to say an element goes across multiple row elements, that's fine as well. And in the next video, we're actually going to show you how this all works, because this is a technique I'm going to recommend that you use. Okay, so for grid layout, our first example, this is just a 3-column by 1 row grid. And then for our next example, you can either do the nesting with 1 column, 2 row grid, and then 2 inner grids, or you can create a 4-column, 2 row grid. And then our last example, we can again either do the inners, you know, with an outer grid and then a bunch of inner grids, or you can do the 3-column by 2 row grid. And if you've been paying attention and you remember what I was talking about a little earlier about how the table worked, you may be thinking this looks exactly like the table. And in fact, I was overjoyed about this part of the drawings because I did not have to redraw anything for the grid-based layout. I just took the table-based layout drawings and I replaced the word table with grid. So 1 column, 2 row table becomes 1 column, 2 row grid. So we started off with the table layout way back when, and are we back to the same thing as we started with? Well, here's the thing. In table-based layout, the table is in the HTML. It's not in the cascading style sheet. So if we want to make changes to the layout, we need to go in and modify that table in the HTML. And similarly, we saw with the floats, you know, there's a bunch of stuff going on with the float, and that's more or less tied to the HTML. You can make some changes, maybe. You can float something to the right instead of the left. But really, you're going to be largely limited to how the HTML is written. And again, with the Flexbox, you are going to be greatly limited by what you wrote in the HTML. This is not the case with the grid-based layout. So I can define the grid in the cascading style sheets. If I want 1 grid for a desktop computer with a large screen, a different grid for a tablet, a 3rd grid for a cell phone, that's totally fine. I can define as many grids as we want. CS105 students will talk about this next week when we talk about responsive web design. CS106E students, sorry guys, you're going to miss out. But I will put up the 105 lectures if any of you are interested in that. And so, you know, we can define all sorts of grids for all sorts of different uses in our cascading style sheets. And then we can place any element anywhere we want on this grid. We are completely unlimited by the HTML. As long as I have a bunch of divs in my HTML, or for that matter, any other block elements, and I give them IDs, I can take any of those elements that I gave them an ID and I can place them in any grid from the cascading style sheet. So this gives us complete flexibility to reorder and redesign and modify using just the cascading style sheets with no changes to the HTML at all. So I think this is just a huge win. I just think that this technique is great. I definitely think it's the future. Really, the only downside, and this is becoming less and less of an issue, 5% of the web browsers out there are not going to be able to use it. Now, I will say, when I first saw this technique, I thought it was really great, and I started teaching it in my 193C class. That's a class on web development for majors. And I taught it for a couple of years, and it still was largely unsupported by any of the web browsers except for Internet Explorer. Chrome kind of had a version that kind of worked for a while. It did not look like what's going to happen, but it's finally happening. 95% of the web browsers now support this. This technique is great. It gives you great flexibility. It's way easier to understand than Float. I think it's easier to understand than Flexbox. Yeah, you can kind of understand what the Flexbox is doing on an individual section scale, but then when you try and lay out the entire web page with Flexbox, it just gets kind of nasty. Grid layout is just great. I'm just a huge fan. And so this is the technique I'm going to recommend you all learn. The only downside would be if you're trying to create a website right now, think about who your audience is and think about whether or not they have modern web browsers. So, if you're doing something where maybe your audience might not have modern web browsers, then maybe this isn't the technique you want to use. But otherwise, I think it's definitely the way to go. This is a great technique. All right. So in the next lecture, we're going to actually show you how this technique works. We're going to teach you how to create the CSS for it and how to put elements on the web page. I'll see you then.